It's a fact that configuring your first audio track to record on takes a bit more work than it does with MIDI or instrument tracks. And so before I record any audio with my real bass guitar on an audio track, I'm going to take the synth bass track and I'm going to right or control click on it and choose Disable Track. And that way I won't hear it during the recording of the real bass track. I may leave it in there so that I could use it later on, but to open up a little more room on my project window, I'm going to go to the Visibility tab and I'm going to uncheck Synth Bass. So that track is still part of the project. It's just invisible right now. And then I'm going to click on the Add Track button right here. I'm going to get the Add Track dialog box. This is going to be an audio track, and the first thing that I could choose to configure on this track is the input on my audio interface from which I'm going to be recording the audio. But let's save that for just a moment. Instead, let's come to configuration, because there's a lot of confusion about this, especially for new users. The best way to determine whether your audio track is going to be mono or stereo is to count the sources, because the number of sources will determine whether your track is going to be mono, stereo, or recorded across multiple tracks, called multi-track recording. So let's start with a simple example like one source. In other words, one microphone or perhaps one instrument. In my case, that's what I'm going to be using in this course, is a bass guitar, which has one output. So for a situation like that, I will be recording in mono. But if I were using multiple microphones, like two microphones on the same acoustic instrument to record that instrument in stereo, or if I were recording a device that had a left and right output on it, like a turntable or a hardware-based synthesizer, those left and right outputs would combine into a stereo track. So in that case, I would create a stereo track. Or if I were using two or more microphones to record maybe two individual singers simultaneously or three individual singers, or if I were putting multiple microphones on multiple instruments of a drum set, for example, then I would be recording in multi-track. So I would need multiple tracks upon which to record. So again, count your sources. In this case, my number is 1. I'm going to be using one source. And that way, when I come to my Add Track dialog box, the configuration will be mono. Then I have to decide where I'm going to record the audio from on my audio interface. And this is where it gets a little tricky for people, because everyone's audio interface is a little bit different, and the way that that interface interacts with Cubase can also be different among all the different manufacturers and models of audio interfaces. Here you can see that Cubase has found my UR28M audio interface, and when I drop that window down, it gives me a list of all of the possible audio inputs on my audio interface. But like I said, everyone's audio interface is a little bit different. For example, some audio interfaces have 2 inputs. So with 2 inputs, I could record a couple of different ways. But for interfaces that have more inputs than that, for example, this interface has 4 individual inputs, or on bigger audio interfaces, some have a lot of inputs, like this particular interface has 4 on the front and 8 additional inputs on the back. So the number of tracks that I can record simultaneously and their configurations is a little bit different depending on the interface. If I were using this top interface, I could record 1 mono track or 2 mono tracks simultaneously, or 1 stereo track. With more inputs, like this interface that has 4 inputs, I could record up to 4 mono discrete tracks simultaneously, or 2 stereo tracks simultaneously, or combinations thereof. And on a big audio interface like this one, I could record up to 12 mono tracks or 6 stereo tracks all simultaneously, or combinations thereof. For example, 2 mono tracks using 2 mono sources, and then maybe 3 stereo sources from 3 stereo devices. So in my particular case, I'm going to plug my bass guitar directly into the first input of my audio interface. So on the audio input setting, I'll need to choose analog input number 1 from which to record. And then I'm going to call this status bass, because that's the kind of bass that I'm going to be using. Then I'll click the Add Track button, and I will change its track to the same color that I use on bass tracks, so it's going to be that red. And you'd think with all that I would be ready to record, but there's still some other things to take into consideration, like input level, and I'll cover that next.